Welcome to Ordinary Teachers and Students, where we get to hear teachers and students tell us their extraordinary stories. My hope is that through this podcast, ordinary teachers from around the world can relate to the stories they hear and get some timely suggestions and ideas. My name is Alan Cheng, and I'm a life coach as well as a university lecturer. My vision is to make life coaching a part of every school. Today, I'm delighted to invite Diane Manser onto our podcast. Diane is a current 18-year high school English teacher in the suburban district of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the United States. Diane teaches ninth graders and has just published a book about the emotional challenges of teaching called I Didn't Sign Up for This: One Classroom Teacher's Journey Through Emotional Fatigue to Personal Empowerment. Diane feels strongly that the education we receive as teachers should emphasize that teaching is an emotional profession, just as it is a content profession. Teachers need to develop intrapersonal understanding to strengthen their teaching abilities and resiliency. I've been really lucky to start reading an advanced reader copy of the book, and I am up to chapter 5 right now, and I've resonated with it at so many different levels. That's why I'm super excited to speak to Diane today, to dive deeper into the idea that teaching is an emotional profession. Let's welcome Diane.
Thank you so much, Alan. I appreciate it. I am delighted, so excited to be here. Thank you for having me on your wonderful podcast. And thank you so much for reading my book so far. And I appreciate that you have me on. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything to add to that intro? Anything else you want our listeners to know about you?
No, I think that was perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, the first thing would be we're recording this before the book is published, right? So by the time this podcast is released, the book should be available, right?
Absolutely. Yes. I'm actually working on the audiobook right now. So
Oh,
I'm
that's so exciting.
hoping, yeah, it has been a really cool experience, really neat. All of this has been a neat new experience for me. And I'm hoping that when everything is released on May 21st on Amazon, that readers will be able to choose a paperback, a Kindle, definite,
Yep.
and then an audiobook if they would prefer to listen to this story and listen to all the messages and lessons.
Sure. We're going to include all this in the show notes. So, shall we go to kind of right to the beginning in terms of what got you started in the first place? Like, what got you into teaching?
Oh, sure. So I was the kid, I think a lot of your listeners would probably resonate with this. I was the
Mm,
kid who loved playing school.
mm,
And
mm.
the biggest challenge I had when I was a kid playing school was trying to find students. So I would grab my favorite stuffed animals. My dad always played school with me. I have
Mm,
lots of beautiful memories of him. He's like a 6'4" guy, and I have
mm.
memories of him like kind of squeezed into a little kid's stool.
Aw.
Yeah, it was so sweet, playing school with me. But yeah, it's interesting going through your career as a student because while I didn't play school forever, I probably
Mm,
stopped when I was, 8, 9, or 10. I loved school. I always loved going to
yeah.
school. I never had difficulty waking up to go to school. I loved my teachers. I loved socializing. And then, of
Mm,
course, because I just appreciated being in that environment, learning and doing activities and sports and contributing, it got
mm,
to the point where then I started to just honor and respect my teachers
yep.
much more than just as human beings. So I revered them. I remember I had Miss Rouse in 11th grade English, and she
Mm,
worked tirelessly for us to make us better writers.
mm.
And if you got a paperback from Miss Rouse and there were few red marks on that paper, it was like you were a gold medal Olympian, you know? It's like you made it. So it's just, despite my love for teaching starting when I was young, just
Yep.
play, it turned into something that became sort of part of my soul. So I would say that's where it started. And then when it came time to pick colleges and choose a possible career path, it was like this natural inclination to want to keep giving back, to
Mm,
want
mm,
to be that mentor, model, leader that I had so appreciated, the coach, the coaches I appreciated in school.
mm,
So that's when I went into my undergrad program. Always had an affinity to literature and
mm,
writing and
mm.
talking. So English was natural for me. And then I thought, well, there's nothing more I'd rather do than be a high school English teacher. And
Wow.
that's how it happened.
I think my wife would resonate a lot with it because, like, very similar to you, she was like playing dolls and always wanted to like teach other people. And that's I think you sound like the perfect student every teacher would have wanted to teach as well. I wonder though, I mean, so like I said in intro, so you've been teaching for close to 2 decades now.
Yeah.
Have you considered quitting in between, or kind of what's made you stay for
Yeah.
these 18 years?
I think that's a great question, and I really appreciate the question. I can't say I have ever formally thought about quitting where I actually had it so stabilized in my mind that I took steps.
Mm,
But I do have to say, despite my love for teaching, despite honestly always wanting to be a teacher and my life kind of guiding me towards that, there have been a lot of times, whether it be like weeks within a school year or you look back on a period of the school year
mm,
that can be challenging. And I have thought, am I really going to be able to do this
mm,
for X number more years? Am I really going to be able to sustain this workload, this energy, sometimes the disappointment in teaching for
mm.
X number more years? And that's where some of those eroding feelings have slipped in for me.
Yeah.
Now, it hasn't been where I then started looking for other careers or I started updating resumes. I never went there because I kind of see some of the problems that I've experienced in teaching as
Mm,
transient.
mm,
And I've always had this sense like there's something I can do that can get me through this. There's something I can do that can make this a little bit better. And sometimes it's really a matter of changing your within perspective, or it's finding those resources that are outside of yourself that can validate and provide some camaraderie in it, even if
yeah.
the situation in front of you doesn't necessarily improve much. And I think something else that happens is this mindset of school years have this way of ending
Mm,
and
mm,
tough
yeah.
situations have this way of ending, and we're in a unique position. I mean, the only other careers that I can think of where that occurs are like professional athletes, where you
Mm, mm.
have this
Like a new
opportunity to
season,
say,
yeah.
yeah, like this season is concluding, and I'm going to reflect and I'm going to consider and I'm going to champion the best parts of myself. And then when I come back into the new season, whether that be a new class or semester or school year, I'm not starting back where I was. I'm actually
Mm,
starting much farther on the timeline. But I think in order to keep our positivity in that way, we have to be willing to acknowledge that there's pain points in teaching
yep.
and there's disappointment in teaching. And that's
Mm,
not the whole story.
mm.
But I think if we acknowledge that that does not happen, I think that we can then get more hurt by teaching.
Yeah, wow, there's so much like really good stuff in what you said just now, like seeing problems as transient, changing the within perspective. And also, I really like the idea of just like when we start a new school year, it always feels like, oh, it's like new hope and like m new opportunities. And so that's something, yeah, I really treasure about like teaching as well. Um, On to the book then. So like obviously, so I've spoken to you before. I know you have children at home as well, right?
I do.
Teaching full time is already tough. Having kids at home is tougher. But to publish a book during this time, what made you do that?
Yeah, thank you. I think again, I'm going back to it being like a matter of will. I
Yeah.
also want to add in, I'm laughing right now because there were so many steps in the process that
Mm,
I didn't recognize were deep steps, deep
mm,
dive steps until I was in it. And then, so a lot of the process of me writing the book and then moving it to publication were I was a bit ignorant, I was a bit naive,
mm.
and I would kind of go into it. I have some friends I'm on a text message with, and I would say, I'm done with my book, it's done. And then 2 months later, I'm repeating the same message, I'm done with my book, it's done. Because it's like you think you're done, and you're like, oh, look what I just did, and then you start giving it out for people to read and review, and then you get
Yeah.
all these beautiful, helpful suggestions that
Yeah.
weren't really on your radar when you were first writing
Mm,
it.
mm,
And
mm,
then
mm,
next thing you know, you're tweaking it and you're adjusting it and you're revising it,
mm.
and that changes a lot of structure. And then you're in that process, and then start to recognize, like, well, I better share this message because I'm just writing it on my own here. and then you want to
mm,
start doing some outreach, and that takes some time, and
mm,
then you
mm,
think, well, I should probably develop this a little bit better, and that takes some time. So yeah, I think a lot of the process has been a matter of like, I can kind of get through this next step, not recognizing the next step that was in front of me.
mm,
And
mm,
that
mm.
definitely served me because it helped me to keep moving.
Right.
And also, as I was writing it and talking with people, it just got so much clearer to me that teachers are very much not just wanting, but needing this
Mm,
message that we have to begin considering our profession as an emotional profession and not just restricted to the content, the lesson plans, the assessments. Those are all urgent and those are all important, and we have to continue crafting those skills. But we have to just pull that spotlight up and look at it more holistically. That we are also in an emotional profession, and a lot of our day is going
mm,
to affect us emotionally. So the more I started talking to people, the more people were like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to read this book, or I can't wait to talk more. And would you run a book club, or would you consider doing
mm,
a little
mm.
presentation, or maybe we could do a seminar and we could get people, at the library conference room and we could all meet and talk. So that also very much propelled me to want to finish the book so that I
Yeah.
could begin doing things with the book.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And let me tell you this, really, congratulations. It's such a major achievement to publish book. Like just listening to you, like all those steps that you mentioned just now, can't imagine all the hard work, burning the midnight oil probably when your kids were asleep, right? Waking up
Yes, that's
early.
when I did most of the work. Yeah.
Yeah, so well done for that. And so I must say it segues onto the main part of the podcast where we choose a topic to take a deeper dive into. I must say we are sport for choice. So before we started recording, so I was emailing Diane and saying to her, okay, I've finished up to chapter 5. We have 14 chapters in your book, right? And I was like, okay, that helps to narrow it down because each chapter I think is worthy of a podcast itself, right? So I said to Diane, like, okay, I'm up to chapter 5. Let's choose something from the first few chapters. So, which one do you want to take a deeper dive into?
Sure. Well, up to chapter 5, I would then choose to focus on the illusion of control.
Illusion of control. Yeah. Do you want to tell us what you mean by that?
Sure, absolutely. So and I still go through this, and the helpful thing is that in teaching, it's never a finished product because
Mm,
life is never a finished product, and teaching is really a microcosm of life. So when we are going through our teaching careers, I think, especially early on, we have this perception, and I think teacher leaders, teacher educators may also fall into this perception too, that because the teacher is in charge, the
mm,
teacher is therefore in control.
mm,
And what I came across after many years of teaching and falling into what I have in the book and what I, will share now too, this control trap idea is
mm,
that because I thought I was in control, it then affected many other things. So I would be working really hard on my lesson plans. I'd have this whole design plan of how things were going to go. And then you go into your classroom, and sometimes it doesn't go that way. Sometimes it does, and you're like, that was great, and everyone feels really good, and you feel really good, and it's fulfilling. And then sometimes you can walk into that classroom, and just because of the setup of the group of students or the personality of that class, there could be resistance, or there could be uncooperation, or
mm,
there could be something else that has impeded and kind of like infiltrated its way into your idea, your model, your plan. And that could really be out of your control.
mm,
And I think
mm,
when we experience those things, we have to be able to acknowledge that teaching is both and, that it will
mm,
be fulfilling and rewarding, and you're going to feel like I'm giving so much more of myself than just this content. And I'm like serving people every day. And for teachers, I think we get into it because we want to give back and we want to serve and we have
yeah.
something of value to give. And then it also is, so it's both and it can be disappointing, and
Mm,
it could be unfilled expectations, and it could leave you with a feeling of self-doubt or inferiority. And when I started to recognize years into my career that I was reacting to situations,
mm,
I began to recognize my reaction was because I thought I was in control. So
mm,
I expected it to go a certain way. And then when it didn't, I was frustrated, or that I would find myself getting annoyed or irritated. And sometimes that can turn into just overall frustration, or it could turn into maybe us reacting to a student or a
mm,
class.
mm.
And I think that has been one of my biggest lessons is we are positioned to be in charge. It doesn't mean that we're in control. We
Yeah.
don't have control over how many students come into our classrooms.
Mm,
Some of our
mm, mm,
classrooms
mm.
could have 30 students in them. Sometimes we could have 16.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't have control over the demographics of students who come into our classrooms or what their home lives are like. We don't have control over those situations.
Mm, mm, mm.
And I think recognizing that can help take some of that pressure off, so we can recognize that we're part of a system
Yeah.
that's supposed to be a full system, that we are not the only driving factor of the system.
Yeah, yeah. And that's so true. I remember when reading this part, the part where you talk about the difference between being in charge and being in control. Like I immediately stopped to think about it. Like that's so true. Particularly I would say when we start teaching like as an early career teacher, right? Perhaps we have this perception that we should be absolutely 100% in control of the classroom. And so that's and I think what you said resonates so much with when I started teaching. I when I felt that like control was slipping from my hands, that's when I started to get more emotional in the classroom, and that's when I started shouting and punishing students. So yeah, so like, what do you think is the best way to get teachers to like understand this? Like, is it simply just awareness, or is there anything else we can do to help teachers appreciate this kind of dichotomy between in charge and in control?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for understanding and acknowledging too that like when that control starts to slip, because you know it in the classroom. Like you
Absolutely.
totally,
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, it takes a 1 second observation, or it just takes
yeah,
a feeling that you have to be like, this is going away from me and
yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't want it. Plus to layer it, we're working so hard on
Mm,
our work. So it's like we don't want to see all the hours that we're spending in our work like not
mm,
come to the fruition that we hoped it would be. But I love your question too, and thank you. I think one, it has to start with the recognition that we are positioned to be perceived to be in control, and yet
mm,
no person can control any other person, whether
mm,
you're a parent or you're a teacher or even administration. I can guarantee you, if we had principals on this podcast, they would
mm,
say, I cannot control the choices of some of my teachers.
mm,
And
mm,
I
mm,
think
mm,
number one, it has to be awareness. Like, for us to expect ourselves to be controlling or like being able to control all the parts of our classroom, I think leaves out too many important conversations and subgroups to come into the conversation. So,
mm,
number one, I think it's awareness. Number two, I think it's accepting that within yourself. Because I think teachers, we have a high expectation for ourselves. We work hard. I also think that a lot of teachers could be in that realm of, I I'm able to get things done. And I'm
mm,
not really the person that others have to rely on to get things done. So I think number two, it has to be accepting in ourselves that we may not be in full control. And that
mm.
can be a very uncomfortable place to be,
Yeah.
but also recognizing that can give us the most leverage and,
Mm,
ironically, the most power.
yeah, yeah.
And
Does
then
that
number
mean? Oh,
three,
sorry, you first. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
sorry. Oh, and then number three, I think it's then sharing that concept with others.
Mm,
So when I have a situation in class, and let's just say it's students who are talking over me, talking through me, not attending to the spirit of whatever we're supposed to be doing in class. And I will literally go up to those students. Now I teach ninth grade, I teach an older group,
mm,
so you can reason with them. But let's just say this is a first time situation, and I'll go up to the student or the group of students and I'll share with them like, this is what I had planned for today, and I am not in control of how you
mm,
choose to behave in here.
mm,
But my
mm, mm.
goal is to move this in a most positive direction, most positive percentage forward that I can. But I can't do that without you cooperating with me. I can't
Mm,
do that without your
mm.
assistance and help, because I'm not in control of you talking over me, you talking through me. I can't make you stop. The best I can do is have you understand that we're in a community. And when you do that, it affects the community and the spirit of what we're trying to do. And then I'll ask them, like, do you recognize that too? Do you see
Mm.
that you're doing that? A lot of times with older students, they'll be like, yeah, okay, I do. All right. And then what can we do like in this next step to try to bring this back
Yeah.
together?
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of a three-step process. Like number one, we're not in control. Number
Mm,
two,
mm.
accepting it in ourselves. And then
Yep.
number three, inviting others into the conversation.
I
And
love
that
that.
might even
Yeah.
be, yeah, with a principal too. Maybe it's a walkthrough, or maybe it's an end of year evaluation. And perhaps that's a conversation that teachers have to bring up. And especially if someone's like, well, I didn't like the way the class was being conducted.
Mm,
And
mm,
perhaps it has to be, I agree. I don't like how the class was being conducted either, but my control is so limited.
mm,
I'm not able to both be teacher and behavior manager. That's a difficult
mm, mm, mm.
position to teachers. So that would be my advice. And that's some things that I've worked through that have helped me just to move a little farther along to um, to recognizing that the control is limited.
Yeah, sure. I love that because I think the last part, particularly the sharing with others, like it feels like you're bringing other people into the conversation. So it's not the teacher's responsibility, like by themselves, like sole responsibility to determine the outcomes of the classroom. I think that's quite important, right? And so it should involve the student, it should involve administrators, other people outside the classroom. They're also responsible too, parents as well, right? I had a question about the second part, which is acceptance. Would you say there's a fine line between acceptance and lowering your expectations?
I do. And I think that is an art. And I think that is a push and pull. Sometimes it's a balance. And I think sometimes it's a battle.
Mm,
And I have gone through that myself. And there are some moments where I'm like, I definitely pulled that as close to the middle as I could, and I did great. And there's
mm,
other moments where I'm like, I really did devalue what I had hoped and expected or what I needed to get out of this class or these students or that
mm,
skill or that assessment. Yeah, and I don't, the interesting thing about teaching is, and the beautiful thing too, it's so rooted in human nature that
mm.
I don't know if any one philosophy, any one trick is ever going to get it completely right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we could go back in time 100 years and have conversations about teaching and learning, and I think people will be bringing up some similar struggles. And I think 100 years from now it could be that way, which is sort of the
Mm,
beauty of it and the challenge of it.
mm.
So, but yeah, I absolutely think it has to be in a recognition of I still have this expectation for you, and I still have this standard for you and for myself, while I recognize that I may not be able to move this as far as I want it to be. And
Right.
sometimes it might have to be, I got this to be 15% better, and
Mm,
maybe that has to be the great, or kind of meeting ourselves and meeting our students where we are. I
yeah,
think is also a skill and an art. I went through lots of school years where I had really high standards, and I was
yeah.
teaching an advanced course. So the students who were coming into me were advanced students, and I had these really high standards, and we were writing lots of long papers, and the grading was tough. And
Mm,
I
mm,
noticed that over time, the students started to get incredibly discouraged and
mm, mm,
frustrated because they were like,
mm.
I'm working so hard and I can't get higher than a blank, or I'm
Yeah.
working so hard and you're still giving me improvement comments. And I
Mm,
was looking at it like, oh, I'm trying to challenge you and challenge myself. And
mm,
and
mm,
we're
mm.
learning so much, and look at how much we're improving. And then I started to recognize there's such a human element that I was missing in all of that.
Yeah.
So I really think it's quite the balance of recognizing we don't want to be lowering our standards. We never want to be
Mm,
giving up or relinquishing responsibility, but
yeah.
we also have to say my control is limited, and I have to be able to have a quiet acceptance to that as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, yeah, sure. I read from this chapter that just one line, like not to test your memory, but I'm sure you know your book very well. But I read a line which was, I learned very quickly that I wasn't teaching myself as a student. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So I'm just the kind of person who's naturally happy and
Yeah.
joyful, enthusiastic. Even when I would walk into, at some point after Algebra 1, and geometry, math got away from me. So I think when you start to go into algebra 2 and it's cosine and sine and
Mm.
trigonometry, I think that really does separate. You're either going to be math oriented and you're going to soar,
Yeah.
or you're going to stay in a more like basic to
Mm.
average, a little bit above average math realm. So even I can look back, even when I was walking into those math courses, high school career or very early college career, because it was just completed, I was still walking in like, okay, we're going to do work today. And I'm excited and I'm glad to be here. And I would say hi to my friends and hi to the teachers, and I would sit down and do the work. And I don't know if every person is going to be able to do that in a classroom. Yeah, and I think that we have to, again, this quiet acceptance that we may say the person I was as a student was this, and that's my story, and that's my narrative, and that's who I
Mm.
was, or maybe that's who I chose to be.
Mm.
And also, I may not have had certain stresses, I may not have had certain griefs that I was bringing into the classroom that
Yeah.
some of our students do. Some of our students come into our school buildings with a lot of hurt, and they
Mm.
come in with a lot of pain, and then to expect them to show up in our classrooms and be this like ever vigilant, consistent student who is going to be leading the way, I think puts an unfair burden on some of
Mm.
our students. And so I had to recognize early on that I thought when I was in college and I thought when I was going into my first teaching experiences that we were going to read books and discuss them, and there was going to be rich conversation and everyone was going to want to share, because I was positioning myself to consider it like the way I had just experienced it in college and my student teaching and my cohort teaching to my college, members. But really, we have to also acknowledge that some students are not going to be the way we were as students. And it
Mm.
doesn't
Mm.
mean that their value is any less, doesn't mean that we give them any less attention or meaning. I think overall, it just means that we again have to meet them where they are and say, I see you and I value you. And I know that you're going to come in here and contribute, and I'm going to build your confidence, and we're going to build this relationship,
Yeah.
and then we're going to take it from there. So I think also recognizing like who you were as a student may not be who you teach. But I also have lots of teacher friends who share that they were the student in high school or in middle school who struggled. And
Mm.
they were the student who didn't always love being in school, or kind of like was there to
Mm.
socialize, or, like teachers have all different background stories.
Sure.
And I think sometimes those teachers see much sooner the students who were like them,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and then they're comfortable with them. And I
Yeah.
think teachers like me, I see the student who was kind of like me, and I'm like, oh,
Mm.
I see a lot of myself in you.
I resonate so much with that because I was kind of like the good student at school. So when you meet students who don't behave the same way as you, you're like, how can you possibly not hand in your homework on time? Like it's just not in my own dictionary like to do so. Right. Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that.
That's
What
funny.
was
Yes.
there anything else that you wanted to add about kind of this illusion of control? Anything else that you think is important for us to remember?
No, I think that's about it for that. And I think though the illusion of control, the reason why I have it positioned as chapter 2
Mm.
is because to me it affects so many other things. So
Yeah.
if it affects your expectations, so I think also recognizing like how much are we rooted in our expectations, and how much are we
Mm.
able to see that yes, I had an expectation and maybe it was fulfilled and maybe it wasn't, and I have to just kind of flow with that. I think also it can be on evaluations too, that I think for some of our newer teachers, just the sheer amount of judgment, improvement needs,
Mm.
perhaps even criticism that happens in those first couple years of teaching is going to be overwhelming because we're not used to it. We're new to it.
Mm.
And
Mm.
we are the classroom teacher. We're the one who's running the show. We're the one who's in charge. So we're the leader, and so any kind of opinion is
Mm,
going to be placed on that classroom teacher. So I think also recognizing like I'm not in control of how some people choose to view me, given that I'm showing up with as much energy, respect, enthusiasm, responsibility as I'm able to. I can't control how other people are going to see it. And I think that's something that the reason why I had that in chapter two is it does really permeate so many other factors in the teaching world.
sure. Thank you so much for that. Do you want to do a few quick fire questions?
Oh, sure, I would love to. Thanks, Alan.
How would your students describe you?
Oh, okay. I think they would definitely use the word nice as their
Yep,
first go-to
that's
word.
always good.
Yeah, I think I'm often like, oh, you're so nice, and oh, you're the nice teacher. And something else I've had to learn, which might help some of your listeners too, is that sometimes we can see, or other people can see our niceness as weakness, and
Mm,
that's not true. So,
mm,
what I've had to learn along the way too is that while I am nice and I love being a joy and a
mm,
sunshine for people, that we also have to have boundaries. And sometimes the nice people have to have some firmer boundaries when we're working with
yeah,
other people. So that's
yeah,
something that's also in the book, but that I've learned and have had to grow in myself. And sometimes again, it's that negotiation or it's that balance or battle.
yeah.
And but yeah, I absolutely just the other day I had a student who in the middle of class, and we were doing a student center activity, in the middle of class, looked at me, raised her hand about halfway in the air, and said, "Mrs. Manser, I love being in here. I love this class.
Oh,
You're so nice, and your classroom is so nice, and it just makes me feel so good to be in here." And that,
oh,
I mean, that is the thing, Alan. Like when you get
yeah,
that, you're like, "Oh, yes, like
yeah,
I'm doing all this for you. I'm doing it for
yeah,
myself
yeah,
too,
yeah,
and
yeah,
someone sees it." So, yeah, I would say yeah, students describe me as nice, enthusiastic. I think some would say I'm funny, but I love that. I love to be funny.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's hard to make ninth graders laugh. It's hard to make them
Absolutely,
laugh.
absolutely.
You can make them laugh at you, but it's hard to make them laugh
Yeah,
with you. And
very
when I do
true.
that, I'm like, yeah, that was a gold moment right there.
Do you have a favorite go-to activity in your classroom?
Yeah, so some of the things that I personally like, I love Socratics seminars, and there's
Mm,
lots of different
yeah,
models for Socratics. Love
yeah.
the opportunity for me to take that step back and see the students lead discussion. I also do something that I call it expert panel. That might be
Mm,
new for people. That's just what I call it. But you know the end of game talk shows,
yep,
and you
yep,
have
yep.
like, yeah, you have the coach up there, maybe a player or two, and they're getting all those
Mm,
questions from the journalists.
mm, mm,
So
mm.
we'll do expert panel. Now I have to say, my students don't always love it. Some students do. Like they're like, "Oh yeah, put me in that expert
Yeah, yeah.
panel." And then sometimes you can put them in expert panel and you can read the room, and the kids are like, "Oh no," because they're on. They're the experts. So I treat it like the audience has paid some admission to come in here, and there's
Mm,
some key topics that the expert panel are experts on.
mm,
And then
mm,
the
mm,
only
mm.
way you as the audience can engage is to ask a question. So you have to, ask a question of the expert panel, and then the expert
Yep.
panel will respond. And
Yeah.
perhaps it's, maybe you're reading a novel or a short story and you are the expert in characterization or character shifts or changes
Mm-hmm.
and motivations. And then that's the expert panel. Like why is that character doing what they are doing? And that's really fun. So I really enjoy that. Student favorites are probably one pagers, and
Mm,
you give them
mm,
a
mm.
template and they can fill that template up. Oh, and even the students who just aren't as inclined with drawing, they
Yep.
they still do a great
Yeah,
job
yeah.
of making it filled up and colorful. So, and then you can display them on the board, and students love to see that and they get motivated, and that's a lot of fun.
Sure, sure. I'm going to ask you a really difficult question. So, other than this chapter on the illusion of code control, which other chapter do you think I should read or pay particular attention to? So it's like choosing
Oh,
a favorite son.
oh my gosh, that's hard. Oh, thank you for that. So I am incredibly proud of the entire book. I am
Yep.
incredibly proud of the end. And
Oh, okay.
so it's in the book, but to share because you asked, a lot of these lessons and a lot of my growth accelerated because I went to see a therapist
Yep.
and he set me up real straight. And then I
Mm,
just started doing so much introspective learning. So at the end of the book, the last like third of the book is when I meet him. And
Mm,
then it's when I share my paradoxes and my struggles. But as you go through, there's just a lot of things that I did that made really big shifts. For
mm,
example, the language that I would use, and also like recognizing that like your joy, your gratitude, and your giving are all tools of empowerment.
yeah,
So my biggest lesson in all of this teaching experience has been, how can I move myself to empowerment when I'm feeling that loss of control, or I'm
mm,
feeling overwhelmed and fatigued, or I'm feeling that like, can I really teach X number more school years? How can I move myself to empowerment, and how can I move myself to a feeling of immovability where I
yeah,
am immovable?
yeah.
And the end of the book is where I share so much of that. So I would say the last chapter, the why, is really powerful. For me, it was a very powerful chapter to write. It was reflective. I could have been surrounded by 100 people, and I would have been writing that
Mm,
in a bubble, an insulated bubble of just like gold light,
mm,
strength, almost like spirit. It was really good. So I would
yeah.
suggest maybe if you want to jump ahead and take a look at that chapter, I would
Such
love
a
to hear what you
teaser.
think.
I would love to read it immediately. So thank you for that. So Diane, it's been such an honor to have you on my podcast. So like I said, publishing a book while teaching full time and having children at home is an accomplishment that I think only teachers with children can fully appreciate. I really admire your courage to be vulnerable, to share your story with the world, and like in to benefit the next generation teachers. So I just want to do a little plug for you to tell our listeners that Diane and her work can be found at three W, sorry, as usual, teachingisemotional.com, where you can join a mailing list to get a sample of the book to see if it's right for you. And you can also follow Teaching is Emotional on Instagram and TikTok and consider joining the private Facebook group Teaching is Emotional. So I'll put all these links in the show notes. And although I haven't finished reading the book yet, I absolutely recommend any teachers, young and old, to grab a copy of it. Diane, like I said, it's been so nice having you, so fun. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Alan, and thank you everyone for listening. I appreciate you, and thanks for all the great questions.
Diane talked about the illusion of control, which is the perception that being in charge is the same as being in control. To break free from this control trap, Diane suggested that the first step was to be aware of this illusion. Secondly, we need to accept that there are many things beyond the teacher's control. And once we accept that, we need to share with others. We need to see the education system as cooperative, and that the responsibility of classroom success does not solely lie in the teacher's hands. I hope you enjoyed listening to Diane's extraordinary story, and I hope you join us again next time on Ordinary Teachers and Students.